It started in the middle of the night. In Caracas, people woke up to sudden darkness as power across parts of the city went out without warning. Then came the loud sounds, distant booms echoing through the capital, followed by the unmistakable noise of helicopters cutting through the night sky. From apartment windows and balconies, people began recording on their phones, trying to capture whatever was happening below. Videos spread almost instantly, blurred lights in the sky, streets lit only by headlights, voices, whispering questions in the background. Was it an explosion? Was it a drill? Was it an attack? There was no official statement, no explanation from authorities, just confusion spreading faster than facts. Social media filled the silence before governments did. In that moment, nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone could feel it. Something serious was unfolding, and it was happening in real time. At the same time, thousands of miles away, Washington wasn't sleeping either. Inside the Pentagon, lights stayed on and staff worked through the night. Online observers noticed something small, almost trivial, but strangely familiar. A sudden spike in pizza deliveries around the Pentagon area. It wasn't evidence of anything, and no one claimed it. But historically, moments like that have quietly coincided with major decisions being made behind closed doors. By morning, the headlines landed hard. The United States had carried out military strikes in Venezuela. President Donald Trump announced that US forces had acted and claimed that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro had been captured and taken out of the country. The Operation Absolute Resolve was not described as a war, but as enforcement, with the United States saying it would temporarily oversee Venezuela during a transition period. For many Americans, this wasn't just another foreign headline. It raised uncomfortable questions. How did this happen so suddenly? Why now? And was this really about law enforcement and security, or something much larger? Because this moment did not appear out of nowhere, it was the final chapter of a story that had been quietly building for months. In this video, we're breaking that story down step by step. We'll examine what was happening inside the United States before this moment, how American military posture gradually shifted in the Caribbean, what happened on the night of January 3rd, what is confirmed versus what is claimed, and how Americans themselves are divided over this action and what it could mean going forward. Before Venezuela entered the headlines, the United States was already focused on a familiar set of issues: immigration, drug trafficking, border security, and organized crime. In the months leading up to the strikes, President Donald Trump consistently framed these problems as being linked to foreign criminal networks and governments that, in his view, allowed instability to reach the United States. Venezuela was frequently mentioned in that context, not as a distant geopolitical issue, but as a source of narcotics routes and illicit financing. At the same time, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was already under extensive US sanctions and facing American criminal indictments related to narcotics trafficking. These legal cases had existed for years and were largely limited to diplomatic pressure and public statements. What changed in the months before the strikes was the tone of US messaging. References shifted from long-term containment to direct action. While most Americans were not closely following these developments yet, this shift in language signaled that existing pressure tools were no longer seen as sufficient. The situation was moving from policy to execution.
The United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault.
The first measurable escalation began months before the strikes, not days. In late August and early September, US officials announced an expansion of counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean Sea, citing intelligence that drug trafficking routes connected to Venezuela were increasing activity. During this period, the US Navy and Coast Guard deployed additional surface vessels, maritime patrol aircraft, and surveillance platforms closer to Venezuelan shipping corridors. According to US statements released in September, multiple vessels were intercepted during these operations, with American authorities claiming the ships were linked to narcotics trafficking. In at least one incident, US officials said a fast-moving boat suspected of carrying drugs was disabled at sea after refusing to stop. Through October and November, US briefings described an increase in interdictions compared to previous years, though exact figures were not consistently disclosed. US officials increasingly connected these maritime actions directly to Venezuela's government, arguing that trafficking networks and state leadership were intertwined. By early December, the scope widened further. The United States seized Venezuelan-linked oil tankers in international waters, with Washington stating that proceeds from oil sales were funding criminal networks. Caracas rejected the seizures, calling them illegal and politically motivated. By this point, the pattern was clear. Surveillance had turned into interdiction, interdiction had turned into seizure, and enforcement language was being used to justify strategic pressure. When the strikes finally happened, they did not represent a sudden shift in policy. They marked the point where months of maritime escalation crossed from containment into direct confrontation. By early December, the pressure campaign shifted toward Venezuela's most critical economic asset, oil. Venezuela holds some of the world's largest proven oil reserves, and petroleum exports account for the majority of its national revenue. In December, US authorities announced the seizure of Venezuelan-linked oil shipments, stating that proceeds from these exports were being used to finance criminal and narcotics networks connected to the Venezuelan state. Washington framed these actions as financial enforcement rather than military escalation. Venezuela's government rejected the claims, calling the seizures illegal and accusing the United States of economic warfare in international waters. What made this phase different was immediacy. Sanctions had restricted Venezuela's oil sector for years, but these actions physically removed cargo and blocked revenue in real time. US officials publicly stated that economic pressure alone had failed to change behavior and that stronger measures were necessary. With American naval assets already operating in the region, enforcement of these measures was backed by physical presence. At this point, the escalation was no longer theoretical. Economic pressure had become operational. By mid to late December, US military activity around Venezuela had increased without any formal declaration of war or new authorization from Congress. American naval assets operating in the Caribbean, including surface vessels and surveillance aircraft, were already positioned to support interdictions and enforcement actions. The United States described this posture as readiness, not preparation for conflict. No emergency congressional vote was held, and no United Nations Security Council authorization was requested or granted. From Washington's perspective, this was framed as an extension of law enforcement and national security operations rather than the start of a military campaign. Critics argued that the distinction was increasingly thin. US forces were operating closer to Venezuelan territory, enforcing economic measures, and maintaining sustained presence without a clearly defined endpoint. By late December, the situation had reached a point where military capability was already in place before any public announcement of strikes. When action finally occurred, it did not require new deployments. The infrastructure was already there. This absence of formal declarations did not slow the escalation. It accelerated it by allowing action to proceed without the delays that normally accompany public debate or international approval. In the early hours of January 3, explosions and widespread power outages were reported across parts of Caracas. Venezuelan authorities acknowledged the disturbances and imposed emergency security measures, including restrictions on movement and a heightened military presence in the capital. Residents reported low-flying aircraft overhead, and regional airspace disruptions followed shortly after. Within hours, President Donald Trump announced that the United States had carried out military strikes in Venezuela. He stated that US forces had captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores and removed them from the country. Unlike the initial uncertainty surrounding the operation, subsequent reporting confirmed the capture. Major news outlets published verified video footage and photographs showing Maduro in handcuffs being escorted by US officials as he exited a plane after arriving at Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York. US authorities confirmed that both Maduro and Flores are now in US custody and are expected to face federal criminal charges related to narcotics, trafficking, and terrorism conspiracies. In his announcement, Trump also stated that the United States would temporarily oversee Venezuela during a transition period, arguing that control would remain in place until what he described as a legitimate and stable leadership could be established. Venezuela's government rejected the operation as illegal and accused the United States of aggression, while international reactions began unfolding rapidly. It is important to note that although verified footage and official statements confirmed Maduro's detention, some images and videos circulating on social media during the early hours were misleading or fabricated, contributing to confusion at the time. This account reflects information available at the time this video was recorded, and any significant updates will be added in pinned comments. What is clear is timing. The strikes did not emerge in isolation. They followed months of naval buildup, interdictions, and economic pressure. That night marked the moment when preparation ended and consequences began. The international reaction was immediate but uneven. Russia and China issued the strongest condemnations, calling the operation a violation of national sovereignty and international law. Both governments questioned the legality of capturing a sitting head of state by force and warned that such actions set a dangerous precedent. The timing added to the tension. Just days before the strikes, President Nicolas Maduro had engaged in diplomatic activity involving Russian leadership and interactions with Chinese representatives, highlighting that Venezuela was not isolated on the global stage. Across Europe, reactions were more cautious than confrontational. The European Union said it was closely monitoring the situation and emphasized respect for international law and the UN Charter. Leaders in countries such as Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom avoided direct endorsement, instead calling for de-escalation, restraint, and diplomatic solutions. None publicly supported the use of force, but most stopped short of outright condemnation. In the Caribbean and Latin America, responses were sharper. Several governments warned that unilateral military action threatened regional stability and called for emergency discussions at the United Nations and the Organization of American States. Supportive reactions were limited and selective, focusing on allegations against Maduro rather than endorsing the method used to remove him. What emerged was not global consensus, but global unease. The operation was no longer viewed solely as a Venezuelan crisis. It was being weighed as a test of how far power can be exercised across borders and who gets to decide when enforcement becomes intervention. Inside the United States, the reaction was immediate but far from unified. Some Americans supported the operation, viewing it as decisive action against a leader long accused by US authorities of narcotics, trafficking, and criminal activity. For this group, the strikes were framed as delayed enforcement rather than the start of a new war. Others reacted with concern. Questions quickly surfaced about congressional authorization, international law, and whether capturing a sitting foreign president crossed a line that could set a dangerous precedent. This debate unfolded against an important political backdrop. In the months leading up to the operation, President Donald Trump had repeatedly claimed that his administration had prevented or de-escalated multiple global conflicts through pressure and diplomacy. Supporters pointed to the absence of large-scale wars during parts of his tenure as evidence of a peace-focused approach. Trump himself publicly suggested that these efforts merited recognition, including references to the Nobel Peace Prize, which he did not receive. Instead, toward the end of last year, he was awarded a FIFA-associated peace recognition linked to international cooperation and diplomacy through sport. For critics, the timing mattered. They argued that launching strikes in Venezuela so soon after presenting himself as a peacemaker created a contradiction that demanded scrutiny. For supporters, there was no contradiction at all. They viewed the operation as consistent with a strategy of deterrence, strength, and selective force to prevent larger conflicts later. Protests and demonstrations reflected this divide, with some Americans celebrating the action and others warning against escalation and unchecked executive power. What emerged was not a consensus, but a fault line. The question was no longer just about Venezuela. It was about how Americans define peace, power, and the limits of action in a changing world. What concerns many analysts is not just what happened in Venezuela, but what this action could normalize. When a global power removes a sitting head of state by force and frames it as enforcement, it creates a precedent that others may reference. Critics argue this could weaken long-standing norms around sovereignty. The question being raised is simple but dangerous. If the United States can justify capturing a foreign leader under criminal charges, what stops other powers from using similar logic? China's ambitions toward Taiwan are often cited in this context. Beijing has consistently argued that Taiwan is an internal matter. If force is normalized under the language of security and law enforcement, critics worry China could claim similar justification. Russia's invasion of Ukraine also enters this discussion. Moscow has repeatedly framed its actions as security, enforcement, and protection, arguments widely rejected by the international community. Analysts warn that selective acceptance of force risks creating a world where power, not law, becomes the deciding factor. Supporters of the US action reject this comparison, arguing that Venezuela is a unique case involving criminal indictments and years of sanctions. But even they acknowledge the risk of misinterpretation. Once a precedent exists, control over how it is cited disappears. What happens next depends on how this moment is handled. Whether the operation remains limited or expands, whether international institutions respond decisively or cautiously, and whether future leaders treat this as an exception or a model. The most important consequence may not be immediate escalation, but imitation. History shows that actions taken once are easier to justify the second time, and that is the uncertainty now facing the world. This story did not begin with explosions, and it does not end with headlines. What happened in Venezuela was the result of months of decisions, pressure, and shifting definitions of power. Some will see it as justice finally enforced, others will see it as a line crossed. Both views now exist side by side. What matters going forward is not just whether this operation succeeds or fails, but what it teaches the world. When force is used without clear international consensus, the precedent matters as much as the outcome. Future leaders, in Washington and beyond, will study this moment closely. They will ask what was allowed, what was challenged, and what was ultimately accepted. This video reflects the information available at the time of recording. As events continue to develop, updates will be added in pinned comments where necessary. For now, the central question remains unresolved. Not what happened in Venezuela, but what kind of world is being shaped when power moves faster than agreement? That answer will not come overnight. It will be written by what happens next. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like so the algorithm knows Globe Wisp exists, consider subscribing for more in-depth analysis like this, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to stay updated as this story develops, ring the bell for future videos.